I feel like in a narrative mood, and I would first talk about how we first met, how you sent me an email last summer, and then we talked on the phone, and how remarkable that was because you said, I knew Muriel, and I have all these radio programs that I did, and I would like to give them to the archive. And I went like, oh my God, that is so great, but where, how are we going to put them? Where are we going to put them? And so this is more ideas for actually maybe even an audio archive that we would like to create, because there are lots of audio artifacts, as Catherine McLeod is also alerting me to. So anyhow, it's a pleasure to introduce Dennis J. Bernstein, radio host, and poet. In 1970, Dennis Bernstein founded the Muriel Rukeyser reading series in Park Slope, Brooklyn. And I guess you still have those tapes from that reading series. Is that the one where Alice Walker was the first poet?
Alice Walker read her poems, and I read my kids' poems that I was teaching in the South Bronx in
Yeah,
East New York. Yes.
yeah. So he is an investigative journalist and the award-winning host and producer of Flashpoints, a syndicated on public and community radio stations across the United States. He is also the author of many articles, too many to list here, in many publications, and 2 books of poetry. The poetry collection Special Ed, Voices from a Hidden Classroom, which won the 2012 Artists Embassy International Literary Cultural Award, and the fabulous and moving collection of visual poems. And you see 2 examples right here on the screen, called Five Oceans in a Teaspoon, published in 2019. It's a beautiful book. You can get it as a physical artifact, and then it has a digital life. It fits very beautifully into your hands. And so with that little note, Dennis, I will hand things over to you, and you just let me know what you want me to do. If you want me to stop sharing screen or whatever, you will let me know.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I appreciate it, and I am really delighted to have discovered you, and that I had an opportunity to spend this hour, this day, and tomorrow really re-immersing myself in the work of Muriel Rukeyser. This is Muriel changed my life, changed a lot of people's lives, but I certainly am among them. So it's an honor to be here, and I thank you and all the participants. I've just learned so much. I'm buzzing. I've reorganized what I was going to say about 10 different times based on what I've heard today, but I'm going to keep this personal. Muriel talked about, she said, some folks say that we're made up of atoms, but Muriel said, no, we're made up of stories. So I would like to tell some of the stories that come out of my relationship with Muriel. And it was quite the odyssey. There actually, up until I was 30 years old, I really only knew about 2 poets. One was my mother, and the other was Muriel Rukeyser. And because my mom had simply mentioned her once or twice. But for me, poetry began essentially, it began early in the morning when my mother would be getting ready for work. And if I was lucky, I would get to make her coffee and help her put on her makeup, which she referred to as war paint, because she would go to work in a major corporation and be wrestling with men every day, fighting for her rights, fighting for the rights of the women around her. And poetry for her became a weapon. You know, um, uh, she would leave a little note over the water cooler about the latest, a very sharp rhymed poems. These are sharp rhymed poems about the latest indiscretion or attack or uh, attempt by men to either grab women or to take credit for things that women were doing in the workplace. And so my mother was battling this with her poetry, and it really was an extraordinary thing for me to sit there in the morning and listen to her talk about what was happening, and help her put on her makeup. She To give you an idea of the kinds of things she did. This is not one on The Office, but at one point she decided to write a poem challenging the uh, Dennis the Menace comic strip writer Hank Catcham, and she was going to make the case that his menace couldn't compare to hers. And so she wrote a poem which started out with, you to search from here to Venice. You couldn't find just such a menace as my son from birth called Dennis compared to mine. Yours is a mere apprentice. I never lived it down. It ended up in the Daily News right under the comic strip. Uh, and my life was sort of, the poetry was at the beginning there. I was about 9 years old. Uh, in Fast forward, in 1975, I was invited to hear this poet, Muriel Rukeyser, read in a library on Long Island. And it was a beautiful sunny Sunday afternoon, but the library was packed. I later learned that was unusual for poetry, but you couldn't, the place was just full with people who were apparently delighted to be there. And as I walked in the door, um, Muriel was actually pointing over my shoulder at a very terrible copy of a Van Gogh painting that was in a frame that was probably more expensive and and sort of more intricate than and more care given than the actual painting. And Muriel was saying, you know, this is she was contrasting this to the cave paintings in central India, and she was talking about how we shred art from the society, how we take art uh, and we don't really appreciate it in context. And of course, if you read the Ajanta um, poem, which is an extraordinarily beautiful poem, you see what she means about art grounded, you know, right in the walls of the caves. I'll just read a little bit of it. It goes, space to the mind, and this is from the Ajanta poem. Space to the mind, the painted cave of dream. This is not a womb, nothing but good emerges. This is a stage neither unreal nor real, where the walls are the world, the rocks and palaces stand on a borderline of blossoming ground. If you reach your hand, you touch the slope of the world, reaching in interlaced gods, animals, and men. There is no background. The figures hold their piece in a web of movement. There is no frustration. Every gesture is taken. Everything yields connections. And that's from Ajanta. Luckily for me, I noticed a year later there was an ad in the Village Voice that after a long break, Muriel Rukeyser would be teaching a poetry workshop at the 92nd Street Y in Manhattan. This is in 1976. She was recovering from a stroke, and she told the class that she thought the best way for her to get back into shape was to do teaching with young people and new poets. And I have to tell you that that was a class that changed my life, and it changed the lives of everybody who was in that workshop at the 92nd Street Y. And the the way that workshop began, and this was very typical Muriel, I understand, was that she went around. There were 10 of us, and she went around the room and she said, you know, she wanted to know how she could help us, what she could do to help us be writers and better creators. And please feel free to ask, because she was there as a teacher and to help us progress. It was beautiful. Um, she went around the table. One of the young poets there was a poet you might know named Sharon Olds, who later became a Pulitzer Prize winning poet. And I remember um, how Sharon said, and I'm going to quote her. Um, uh, she quoted Muriel's poetry, the first line of her first poem. I have it up here. Breathe in experience, breathe out poetry. I want to, and she said to Muriel, Sharon said to Muriel, I want to learn how to do that. And Muriel said, oh, I can help you do that. I can help you. And she went around and it came my turn. And I have to explain that I had only written my first poem. You had to send in 10 poems. So I decided I would send in the one poem I wrote called The Rabbi and 9 poems that kids in my so-called emotionally disturbed class in Far Rockaway had written. I didn't claim that they were my poems. I explained to Muriel in the letter that I had only written one poem. So I'm also sending you these poems from my children who I care about. When it came to my turn in that first class, uh, I said, and I was very troubled. I said, Muriel, the New York City school system is falling apart. The school that I teach in doesn't even have a librarian. They use the library to punish kids, and we don't have the books we need. I also complained about the food and how troubled the situation was. And well, uh, the it was a beautiful first workshop, and I was totally inspired. I got home about an hour after I got home. The phone rang, and it was Muriel Rukeyser. And in this sort of like deep lion's voice, she says, "Dennis, this is Muriel." Why is why are you calling me? I knew by then she was a virtual landmark of poetry. So why is she calling me? She says, Dennis, this is what I want you to do. I want you to make me a list of all the books you can think of that you want your kids to have, and all the books you can't think of yet that you want your kids to have, and bring it in. Keep me posted. I want to know what that list is like. We're going to see what we can do in terms of getting books for your kids. After the second class, in the second class, before she kicked into the teaching mode, she said, everybody, we are now together in a project to raise books for Genesis kids. So I want everybody to start bringing in books that you find, that you have, that you think his kids could use, because we're going to do our best to get books to these children in Far Rockaway. It was a Far Rockaway was sort of an important place to her because she spent uh, her childhood with her families in Far Rockaway, and she was very interested in what was going on now in Far Rockaway. Of course, when she was going there, it was a summer. Uh, it was where people from Manhattan went to summer for the city in their little summer cottages. By the time I got there, those summer cottages were essentially fire traps for extremely poor people. And oftentimes, when I was teaching there, I'd look out my window, you'd hear the sirens or you see the smoke uh, going up, and you could hear the kids talking to each other. Hey, Emery, is that your house or is that my house? No, that's yours. This is the one with the car up on the jack in front of it. That must be your house. So fire was a problem at that time. These were very poor kids. Um, After the second class, Muriel asked me to stay after. And mind you, this is the 92nd Street Y. We're on the second floor. It's the poetry library. There are all these huge photographs of the poet, all the poets of our time. Robert Frost over there, Elizabeth Bishop over there. And I'm sitting alone with Muriel in this library, and she says to me, "Okay, Dennis, I want you to read me that rabbi poem." Little did I know that I was linking with Muriel on some of the most crucial issues to her in terms of struggling with Judaism and progressive Judaism. So I read the poem that I come from a long line of rabbis. My grandfather wrote prayer. His name was on the matzah boxes on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. So this was, but that rabbi was no longer alive, and the rabbi, my uncle, who took his place, was a brutal character who was very punishing to women. His wife used to come in. We used to live in Levittown. His wife would sort of run away from home and stay in our house. She'd have to eat, kosher out of cans. But it was, my mother was sort of giving her a space, and I would overhear the struggles and all the kinds of things. And so I read that poem, which ended uh, the version that I had written at that time ended, Max, the rabbi who would trust the fascists first if he spoke Hebrew, the rabbi who taught me to hate Jews. Muriel was like, she says, "Wow, you nailed it there, Dennis, didn't you?" Uh, and we that's where our friendship began. That's where the seeds were watered for our friendship. Um, she asked me if I would drive her home. That was to her longtime partner, Monica McCall's house on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. She said, "I want you to drive me home because Monica and I bought a little stove for you so you can cook in the classroom with your kids." And they didn't, because I was complaining about the junk food that they feed the kids. So she was, it was nourishment with books, nourishment with a stove. The third class was introducing The Gates, the book that she just had finished. She had recently, well, a year or so, returned from South Korea, where she was pleading for the life of the poet Kim Shi-ha, uh, who was facing a death sentence, and so she was pleading with his life. And the beautiful long poem, The Gates, is all about that, and it's an extraordinary poem. So after the class, all of us had a chance to walk down with Muriel into the auditorium at the 92nd Street Y, the Poetry Center, and hear Muriel read from The Gates. And I'll never forget that. And I'll never forget. And at first, I doubted this action. I was so suspicious. She had the people who moved the equipment around and all the stuff in the place come and take the podium out from in front of her, because, as she said, she didn't want anything between her and the people. And I'm thinking, oh, is that a sort of just something she says? Or but about 10 minutes into the reading, I realized that this woman meant what she said, and she never said anything she didn't mean. And that also meant that she could be very tough. So that relationship with Muriel just blossomed. And so every week after the workshop, I would drive her home, and we'd have these I'd look forward to those. I'd look forward to that all week. It's unbelievable, really, when I think about it. And I remember on one of those rides home, I was I'm sitting in the car with Muriel Rukeyser, thinking, what can I ask her? I want to make a conversation. And so I said to her, Muriel, you were friends with Pablo Neruda, weren't you? My little peepy voice. And she says, yes, we got to know each other. And I said, could you talk a little bit about Pablo Neruda? And she said, well, Janice, I could talk a little bit about Pablo Neruda, or I could be quiet a little bit about Pablo Neruda. And there was absolute silence in the car, at which point I smacked into the back of a taxi cab. Bam! She turns to me and says, boy, you really express yourself, don't you? That's how you are, right, Muriel? She says, oh, I'm fine. It was just a little like tap thing, luckily. It wasn't anything worse. And I thought I was going to be witty. And I said something like, well, at least I can say I'm one of the few people who got in a car accident with Muriel Rukeyser. She said, oh, no, don't count on that. So my life with Muriel progressed. And it was an extraordinary time because, as I said, she was recovering. This class was about her. Little did I know this was part of her training program for recovering from this stroke. One of the it's interesting. One of the reasons that I went and met Bill Rukeyser for the first time in Sacramento was I went there with Dina Rukeyser, and Muriel had some journals. And among the journals, she was writing about what it takes to recover from a stroke. And she's talking about this process of how you have to do it every day. That recovery is a process. And if you don't go forward, you go backward. And it was obviously, I'm not doing her description a great service, but in any event, it turns out that I essentially became sort of her freewheeling orderly. She used to say she said she was in training for Muriel Rukeyser Day at Sarah Lawrence College. And so this friendship evolved. And let me see if I can get this uh, in order, in the order. So, yes, just about at this time, uh, they were showing the New York Film Festival was featuring, I noticed this in the Village Voice, they were featuring the film They Are Their Own Gifts, which featured Muriel, three artists, and Muriel was one of them, talking about her life and her work. And there is, by the way, in that film, an incredibly beautiful description by her of being in Spain, trying to go and support the Republicans against the fascists. And it's beautiful, beautiful film. Um, so uh, being pretentious, I don't know. I guess I just didn't know my boundaries, but I called her up when I saw this ad and I said, Muriel, can I can I take you to the film festival where they're featuring your film? And it was like, nah, and hung up. I was crestfallen, of course. 5 minutes later, the phone rang again. She was hysterical, laughing. She said, "You know what? I think you should take me to that to the film festival." So I was like, okay, it was in a couple of weeks. So I went to the film festival. I went to her place the day of the film festival, and I picked her up at the door. This is on the Upper East Side, and I said, so I helped her get in the car. She was moving very slowly, but she said she was feeling well, and I was about to shift it and head up to uptown to the theater, and she put her hand on my hand and she said, "Wait a minute." I said, "Okay." She says, this is the time to ask me. I want to help you. Oh, I should say, in the library, after I read to her, she looked at me at the 92nd Street Y and she said, "Whatever it is you want in this world, I want to help you get it." After I we talked about the rabbi and all that stuff. Anyway, zoom forward to the film festival. I'm sitting in the car with her and she says, "So tell me your dreams. What can I do for you?" And I'm sitting, I'm like, I can't, I'm not even sure what to say. And so being very practical, I said, "Well, Muriel, one of my dreams is I'd like to interview you and the filmmakers after the film. Would that be okay?" She said, "Oh, absolutely." And then we headed off. I was so unconscious. We got to the theater, we rounded the corner, and there's about there were at least 10 or 15 photographers, reporters, and Muriel's on my arm. We walk up to the theater and there were people snapping pictures. And, all of a sudden I'm like in the middle of this scene and I was clearly over my head, but I had a chance to escort Muriel to that theater to watch that film and watch her respond to questions from all over the theater. It was an extraordinary moment. I hope somebody has that documented because I don't. Um, but then a week later, she kept her promise, and we got together in Westbeth with the filmmakers, and we talked about the film and the multiple struggles in making the film. And sorry for my tears here. Uh, and it was beautiful. It was exquisite, and the filmmaker said, "Oh, it really wasn't a struggle. It was a pleasure working with Muriel." And Muriel says, "Come on, you." How hard did you have to work to get those documents? Was it? Are you saying this just came? This just happened? And it was a beautiful conversation. After that, after the interview, Muriel asked me, this is, she has been living with Monica McCall, but this is a chance to go back to her apartment in Westbeth, where also the filmmakers lived, because she wanted to check her mail and see if everything was okay in her apartment. I had never been there before, so we walked from the filmmakers' apartment. It's a big apartment complex. If you don't know Westbeth, it's huge and it overlooks the river, the Hudson River. It's unbelievably beautiful. So we're outside the door of the apartment, and she's struggling to get the key in the door. And at a certain point, she just turns around and she says, "Dennis, thank you. I love the way you did the interview, the way you handled the filmmakers. I didn't do anything." She says, "And of course, we've always loved each other, haven't we?" She turned around. We finally got the key in the door. We went into her apartment. If you've ever been there, I don't know if you've ever been in that apartment, but it's a beautiful, wide open space. And there's one tiny desk in the middle of the space with a manual typewriter. I think it was a Smith Corona on this little desk looking out onto the river, in which she has memorialized in many poems in many ways. And so that was uh, that was an extraordinary moment in getting to know this person. That's when I began to study and read, really for the first time, being inspired by this experience, by this poet, seeing how consistent she said things and she meant them. I had been a life full of people saying things and not meaning them. And this was somebody who acted on what she believed. And she was an example, clearly. She was my first real example of a way to live, to speak truth to power, to, you know, anyway, the on the way back uptown to Monica McCall's place, she often did this. She had me pull over in front of a Baskin Robbins place and get us both ice cream cones. And she said, she said, I'm not supposed to eat this ice cream cone. So just get me a single scoop. And we sat in the car there and eating our ice cream cones and talking about life in San Francisco, which I had been coming back and forth between New York and San Francisco. And we were talking about what a lonely place it was. And that's when she told me the story about how she was fired from the radio for nudity on the radio. Apparently, she was reading a D.H. Lawrence uh, short story. It was a little too evocative for the censors there, and so she didn't last long. Of course, she was not going to accept the fact that it would be censored, so it was a short-lived career. Bill thinks there was some kind of problem there. He didn't know this part of the story, but and we, in sharing that ice cream cone and taking sort of, she saw how nervous I was, and I always, when you're walking with her in a way, it's so she really, she changed my life. I drove her back to her apartment, and that's when she said, I really appreciate you coming to visit me. I'm going to be in training now for this Muriel Rukeyser Day. My collected poems are coming out. And, you know, thank you for helping us. I was helping her by taking her to the movie, and I was helping her by interview the filmmaker. I wasn't help. I was, it didn't feel like I was helping her, but she was always so appreciative, and she would always, and so I started visiting her on a regular basis, and she was always pushing me. She was so gentle, but fierce at the same time. And at the time, I was also teaching in Rikers Island Prison, and I was doing writing with prisoners. And so one day she sat me in, she poured a big glass of brandy from me. She says, "You're going to drink this." She says, "Drink some of this." I said, "Okay." I never drink anything, but I drank some of the brandy. And she said, "Dennis, you've got to do a lot more writing. You've got to get a lot better." She says, "What I want you to do is that when you go to prison, when you go to the classroom, whatever you do, I want you to write me a letter and tell me what happened every day." So I started writing those letters. And the writing of those letters really turned me into a writer when I really had to think about things and she would respond. And it was an extraordinary moment. And as we got close to Muriel Rukeyser Day, that was planned for Sarah Lawrence, she was also having some physical struggles. And so once in a while, I'd show up there and I would take her to the doctor's office or something like that. I remember one time I dropped her off at the doctor's. Then I came inside and I was in the waiting room when she comes out and she ends up telling the doctor and the all the people in the waiting room a joke about this guy, who woke up one day and he had a frog growing out of his skull, and he didn't know why there was a frog growing out of his skull. So he went to the doctor and he said, "Doctor, look, I've got this problem." And the doctor asked the frog, "When did that wart start growing on your head?" Or so I'm messing up the joke, but there was there was always a joke, and there was always a little bit of a scene, whatever it was that we were doing. Uh, we she it was an extraordinary moment. I ended up uh, coming back to do a promotion for Muriel Rukeyser Day at Sarah Lawrence College, and it was the last reading other than the actual day at Sarah Lawrence College that I recorded of hers, and so she couldn't find her. She didn't have the enlarged books of her poems. She was having trouble seeing. So she sent me to the bookshelf. She said, just take out whatever books you want. And I sat below her and she said, just tell me what you want me to read. Hand me the poems and I'll see if I can see them and read them. I showed up. I didn't actually have a microphone stand. I had an old sort of tape recorder with a built-in mic, got good sound. So in order to set up a structure, I taped the mic to a broom handle. And so I'm recording the the interview with the broom handle, and she just loved the idea of the broom handle as the microphone stand. She said, I love invention, invent, always invent. Uh, so anyway, we did a beautiful recording. In the middle of that recording, we came to the poem, The Root of the Wine. She read the poem. She came to the end of it and she said, I thought this poem was a lot longer. I could have sworn this poem was a lot longer. And I sort of just peeped up, said, well, maybe Muriel, you haven't finished writing it yet. And she lit up. I mean, I can't, she said, right, exactly. I've been struggling. I have a collected poems coming out. And I always thought collected poems are by men and by dead men. And here I am, a living woman having collected poems. And it sort of made it difficult for me to think about what is the next poem I should write? What should be the next thing? And I was stymied. But now I know, having seen that there's more to this poem to write. I know which poem I have to write next. So thank you, Dennis. And I'm sitting there saying, oh, really? Well, you're quite welcome. But it was exquisite. The relationship was exquisite. I ended up recording Muriel Rukeyser Day at Sarah Lawrence College. Was if was anybody there? Sarah Lawrence Day? 1980. Like I said, Muriel said she was in training. It was an amazing day. Grace Paley, Alice
I was
Walker.
there.
You were there?
Louise,
Oh,
yes, I was there.
so you remember
I do
the
remember that.
the
She sat,
opening?
she
Go on.
sat with the television commentator, her nephew on
Bill
the stage.
Rukeyser, a different Bill.
Yes, a different Bill.
Yeah,
She sat with
yeah,
them. Yes.
yes,
But,
and yes, go on, please.
but didn't she become ill?
Well, this is what I want
You
to.
can tell that, yes.
This is the story. So I was there, sort of in the first couple of rows, and she walked in with Bill, uh, uh, and me and another fan of Muriel's were recording for the day, and I couldn't help myself. I yelled out and I said, "We love you, Muriel." She turns around, you know, she she jerks around and she sort of, I think she vaguely found me in the audience, but she didn't smile. She turned back and headed up on stage. She gave the most beautiful talk to open that day. A gorgeous discussion about the history of poetry and writing and not writing and the students at Sarah Lawrence and how Alice Walker was one of her first students there at Sarah Lawrence. It was just exquisite. The day was exquisite. And I'm going to ask Louise to jump in at a certain point. At the end of the day, she read the last poem she had ever written, and that was a poem for Alice Walker. And it was a poem about their friendship, about Zora Neale Hurston. It was an extraordinary, she read it perfectly. And then she collapsed backwards into her chair. And essentially, she went unconscious. She went to the hospital. She stayed alive. I am convinced she stayed alive to finish that poem and to make it through Muriel Rukeyser Day. And you remember that, right, Louise? You remember that moment.
I remember because I had wanted to come and say something to her. I was in the audience. I don't think she knew I was coming. I lived in Massachusetts, and I wanted to come up after and talk to her, but she collapsed, and I don't remember if I had any further contact with her. I'm not sure, but you know, that's what I remember. It was a shock.
And again, I absolutely am convinced she manifests the energy that she needed to finish that poem and heal that relationship with Alice Walker. And it was amazing. I don't have, there's a lot more I could say, but I think I'd like to leave it there and just read a poem or two. This is my book, Special Ed, and this is based on the teaching that I was doing during the time that I was taking the Muriel Rukeyser workshop. And I should say that it was an amazing workshop. As I mentioned, Sharon Olds and a number of extraordinary poets were in there. And on the last day of the workshop, Muriel said to the class, you know, it was so beautiful. She said to the class, she said, you know, I wasn't sure what was going to happen. I haven't taught in a long time. I'm recovering from an illness that I hate. But this was such a beautiful workshop. You think we should do another 10 weeks? Everybody's hands up. Who wants to come for another 10 weeks? We're gonna come. She could have said another 1,000 weeks and everybody's hands would have been up. But unfortunately, in the break, she had another stroke. And so that was the time between, you know, initially me meeting her, and then there were a couple of years where she was out of commission, and then she came back into commission. When her first reading after the stroke was done in Far Rockaway, where I used to teach the kids, and I went to hear her reading The Gates, and she sees me in the audience, and she says, I had already written to her. I said, I want to start the Muriel Rukeyser Center for the Arts in Brooklyn. But she hadn't written back because she was recovering from the stroke. But as soon as she saw me, she said, Dennis, I want to help you with the Arts Center. How can I help you? I said, just saying you want me to do it. She wrote a beautiful little introduction for the opening. I also got, about a week later, I got a check in the mail for $500, which was a lot more then, in support of creating the Arts Center. It was a reading series, and it was workshops for children. And what can I say? As soon as there were two wonderful poets, Carol Polkover and Dorothy Friedman, who helped me found that they knew Muriel's work and I knew Muriel. So it was a perfect combination. And they helped me put together this poetry series. All you had to do is say, would you like to come and read at the Muriel Rukeyser reading series? And whoever the poet was said yes. And we had Quincy Troop, Audre Lorde, Alice Walker, Gregory Orr, Colette Inez, Jane Cooper, Robert Bly, Ron Padgett. That was the opening salvo. And there were other people, but it was extraordinary. And they all came because Muriel was at the core, the inspiration, and they were all anxious to read at the Muriel Rukeyser reading series. And that is where I started my radio career, because public radio in New York heard about the reading series. They called me up and they said, can we put this on the radio? And that was how Muriel began my, not only my poetry career, but my radio uh, career. Anyway, uh, so just a poem or two. This is called Paulie's Bouncing Bible. He carried his basketball wherever he went. Sometimes he bounced it fiercely and took aim at hoops that only he could see. Sometimes he twirled it on one finger like a bulbous ballerina. But mostly Paulie held the ball between his palms, against his chest, the way a preacher holds a Bible to make God's point. Just like his mother's little Christ, it strengthened his grip on things, extended his palms around a world he was barely able to hold on to. And this is called No Tongue in Cheek. Pierre is on the run from Haiti. He had to leave in a hurry when the soldiers came to cut his mother's tongue out. He says they took her tongue because she talked too much. But Pierre could never get enough. Even when she scolded him, it was kisses. Some nights he dreams about his mother's tongue, flies it around like a magic carpet. And should we show a few of the poems? So let me explain that my latest book is Five Oceans in a Teaspoon. And I've worked with the visualization, he's an artist, a writer, and he's a visual genius. His name is Warren Lira. And he created, the book is visualized, and there are a series of animations that go along with the book that are up at, you can, the animations are up at fiveoceansinateaspoon.com. And I'm going to see if we can show you a couple of them now.
So right now I have the Alzheimer's up.
Let's start with Living with Alzheimer's.
Okay.
Living with Alzheimer's.
Go back to this. I think I did. Sorry, I stopped it earlier in midway. So I should.
There it is. That's it.
It lets me. Yeah.
And can we zoom up to the knitting club?
Okay, is that
It,
also part of an
down.
further down?
No, up. I mean up. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Is it
The it's
animation?
on right there. The
Oh, there
knitting
it
club.
is. Yes. Okay, we have to go up a little further. There it is. Oh, wow.
And do we have time for one more, or
Sure, sure.
how about this is a little sharper? This is called police brutality on steroids.
Okay, there it is. Okay.
So I just so I just sort of end with that. You know, Muriel, one of the most important lines she wrote to me was, "Do I move toward form? Do I use all my fear?" And this is sort of this book, Five Oceans in a Teaspoon, is that sort of moving towards a new form, sort of a way of breaking out and expanding the meaning of the poem and making it available in different ways. So I think it's in the Muriel's tradition of moving toward form, and I want to tell you that it my life would not have been the same, Bill. Uh, and I also know this, and you know this, Bill, better than I do, that I'm one of dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of people who've had their lives transformed, changed, if you will, turned upside down uh, by Muriel Rukeyser. So I'm grateful to what you're doing, Elizabeth. And uh, thank you. Really, thank you. Thank you, Bill.
Well, thank you so much, Dennis. What a lovely way to sort of head toward an ending of today with a full-fleshed story of how she transformed your life and giving us all the other really wonderful. You know, I wonder whether you still have some of the letters you wrote her. And there's so many fascinating things. And I've been asking you about that rabbi poem. But we have a little time. So if there are some questions you want to ask, we can do that now. And obviously we can also, just for a bit, we need to take a little break too. And then I forgot, Casey, when our happy hour is supposed to start. You will let us know. But right now we are still with Dennis. So have you have any comment?
I just want to say, Dennis, that was just beautiful, just beautiful. I did not have a relationship like you had with Muriel. We corresponded, but when she said to you, "What can I do to help?" what she always said to me was, "I will answer all your questions. I will answer all your questions." So I kept writing and asking. I mean,
you get the answer.
I mean, it was an engine. I mean, she was just so generous.
Yes.
Yeah.
But she was tough. But she was tough. She at one point, she said, "You know, you have to do a lot more writing." I said, "I am writing." She says, "You're not writing.
Yeah.
Don't tell me you're writing. Just have another sip of this and think about it."
Yeah.
Phil has his hand up. Just go ahead, Phil.
Thank you, Dennis. Some of those stories are brand new to me. Some of them are ones that I knew, and so thank you for illuminating that part of her life. It was, as you know, a painful time for her,
Yes.
and she recognized that she was coming to the end all too soon. But I appreciate your stories, and I can add to that the joke that she told at the doctor's office, because that was one of her favorites, and I had heard it from her a number of times.
I'm sure.
And basically the doctor said, seeing this problem, how did this all begin? And the frog said, "Well, Doc, I had this lump on my ass." And
That's right.
that was one of her favorite stories. And I wanted to get back to a question that came up before the break. It was from Eulalia in Catalonia about the Book of the Dead. And yes, as you guessed from your question, the original intent was that the Book of the Dead would be published separately, and it would be a book. And yes, of course, its title is a reference to the old Egyptian text. No, it does not mean that she believed in magic, but she recognized that at least religion was important to a lot of people, even if she had a tenuous relationship with it. And the idea originally, as she told the story, was that it was going to be published, this entire poem cycle was going to be published as a separate volume with the photographs of her good friend Nancy Naumburg, who she knew in Hollywood as well as back east. And for a variety of reasons, I think budgetary problems with publishers and other things as well, this original vision of Muriel and Nancy never came to pass. In the new University of West Virginia Press edition, there are 3 surviving Naumburg photos, which should have gone into this hypothetical volume. Unfortunately, after Naumburg died, most of her photos got lost, and so there will never be an edition as they had originally intended, but that was what they were hoping for.
Yeah, Trudy, you have your hand up.
Yeah, this is just extraordinary, Dennis. This is such a gift. It's so wonderful to hear your memories. And I guess I was wondering, with your work, that I think that Muriel had done some work with kids and poetry with Herb Cole, maybe a little earlier in Harlem. Did she ever talk about that with you?
Oh yeah, and I mean, I think that was one of those many connections that we had. But the Ballad of Orange and Grape sort of reflects that experience when she it's I'm sure everybody knows the poem, but it's a beautiful sort of what do you call it, a lament, when the guy at the Frankfurter stand is pouring orange into the one marked grape and grape into the one marked orange, and she's sort of using that structure as a, don't you know what you're doing to the kids that I'm teaching down the street? How are they going to know the difference between war and peace, life and death, yes and no, if you keep marking orange into pouring orange into grape and grape into orange forever? So yeah, that was one of those beautiful connections I made with Muriel and the children. And she really, when she came up with the stove, I mean, I was shocked by the books, but when she said, "Drive me home, I got a stove," I thought, oh, this is something else here, and yeah.
Yeah, just lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The
Thank you,
Ballad of
Elizabeth.
Orange and Grape also opens up to so many different interpretations. Vivian, let's take at least two more, and then let's see whether there are some people in our happy hour and whether we want to transfer there. Vivian.
Dennis, this was wonderful. Just, thank you so much. I love the Galway Canal poem about a reading where Rukeyser collapses at the end. I just had to speak to your point about the Ballad of Orange and Grape. That's as Elizabeth says, open to so many different kinds of interpretations, and not to harp on this, deconstructing binaries theme, but I can't quite get away from it. There are enticing readings in which the poet Muriel Rukeyser is aware of the fact that she's lecturing the hot dog vendor about how to live, and that there's a kind of cultural imperialism there. And there are readings in which the poet Muriel Rukeyser is distinct from the persona who feels it necessary to give this kind of instruction.
Yeah, I've thought about that, and it's just part of the complicated life and times and writings of Muriel Rukeyser, and who that's one of the reasons why I never really would read the poem, because after a while I was concerned about the understanding the poem and what she meant and where she was coming from. And I did have some of those questions, but I never got a chance to talk to her about it.
Well, that's certainly a marvelous poem to take into a classroom and to unpack the levels of ambiguities, what the guy at the hot dog stand may have thought, what the mother with the little child may have thought, so I think she opens up all those perspectives. Eulalia had a question about the title of the movie you mentioned, and I think it's called They Are Their Own Gifts.
That's right.
And I'm not sure, but I think Penn Sound has it available, perhaps.
It's up. If you Google it, you can find it.
You can find it, yes.
Yeah. Yes. Pretty well.
Yeah.
Around.
So what do you think, in some ways we could just, I feel since I put that happy hour on the schedule, we should maybe try it, but if you all let me know, I need some input here. I feel, you know, if we have a different Zoom, everybody can participate a little bit easier in person. And so, Casey, why don't you put it in, and we can reconvene there for a little bit, and maybe you can have something nice to drink, and I will be there. And if we have some additional questions, we can keep it shorter or longer, but maybe a little bit of relaxing at the end of this very full day. I do agree that my mind is bopping, but it's lovely to end with stories. So maybe we can have a little storytelling.